this the? Oh, this is.
Personal.
Yeah, I read from the pantry. Yeah, otherwise you have to lean into it. Right, right. Like this.
These mic stands are much better. Steel one, take one.
There's only one page on this.
Good evening, everyone. This is the regular session of a Board of Education meeting. We already met in executive session, so we already did this flag salute and the roll call in executive session. I'd like to point out the statement of public notice on your agenda. This is I'll just read parts of it, actually. We welcome input from the public. Board of Education meetings are recorded, and barring any technical difficulties, the recordings will be available to the public. There are 2 times during Board of Education meetings that the public is invited to speak. One time is early in the meeting, and that you'll see on your agenda is the, you'll see item number 10, public comment on agenda items. At this point, you may speak on any item that is on the agenda. Towards the end of the meeting, there's another public forum to address any topic whatsoever. When you come up to the podium, please put your name and address on the clipboard. Understand that our public forums are not structured as question and answer sessions, but they are offered as opportunities for you to share your thoughts with the board. Any board response to public comment will be addressed during board forum or during committee reports later. Okay, now we're up to item number 7, our student representative, Molly Farrell. Welcome, Molly.
Hi, I'm the Vice President. I'm filling in for Alexa Thomas. For student government, right now the junior class is organizing the Ridge Factor, which is on March 27th, and it's a talent show that all the student government helps out with. And the senior class is organizing Mr. Ridge on April 24th, so we're expecting really good turnouts for those. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Molly? No? Do you know how many people have entered in Mr. Ridge?
I think 5 or 6.
5 or 6?
Yep.
It's always fun. I saw it a couple years ago.
Yeah,
It's funny.
They're funny.
Okay. Well, thank you.
No problem.
You're welcome to stay, or you're welcome to
Okay.
go if you have work to do, other things to do.
Thank you.
Okay.
No one ever stays. No.
Yeah. Okay, at this point, we're up to item number 8, board presentation. The board is going to go down to sit there for the presentation. And just to point out to everyone who's here, there'll be questions from the board after the presentation. So these questions are for board members to ask. Later, if you have comments on the presentations, you can do that during public comment. Okay, thank you.
Interested in assessment. We are going to span the gamut tonight on assessments. We're going to talk a lot about the both local, national, and state level assessments. So you'll see the theme tonight. We'll talk about quarterlies. Dr. Heineman, our Director of Curriculum, will speak to that. We'll then move to a discussion of our MAP test, and Ms. Fox will speak to that, our Social Studies Supervisor. And then finally, the PARCC assessments. Mr. Hall, our Science Supervisor, will speak to that. I'm Sean Syed, the Assistant Superintendent. I'll give a little bit of an introduction, then I'll talk a little bit about the common theme of assessment, the types of assessments, and how we feel these assessments are going to impact our schedule. We realize that one of the themes we're seeing is that time is a premium, and we want to make the most of that time with our students. And so in order to maximize instructional time, we really feel strongly that there are some things that we can put into place. One of those is planning. And so one of the things that we've done is we've really taken the bull by the horns with the state assessment and the national assessment. We've started to look at ways to maximize time, and you'll see that theme throughout the presentation tonight. So one of the things that kind of gets lost in the discussion of assessment, and this is something that as folks who have worked in curriculum for years never gets too far away from our hearts, that is this idea of assessment and what is the purpose of assessment. And so one of the things that should never be lost, and I see some of the teachers in the audience tonight, so I know this is never lost for them, that is to improve teaching and learning for students. So obviously the goal with assessment is to look at the data that you collect, whether it's a formative or summative assessment, and look at ways to help the students increase their learning, to maximize learning. And that's really at the forefront of assessment design. And so when you look at any assessment, whether it's the quarterly assessment at Ridge High School, or we like to think the PARC assessment nationally, that there is some thought into student retention and to maximize student learning. And so one of the things that we want to see on an assessment is a mastery of student learning. So it could be at the end of a unit, it might be at the end of a course, it might be even at the end of a class period. And so that's really and speaks to the idea of using results to make instructional adjustments. This is something that teachers do daily. In fact, teachers do this moment by moment when they elicit responses from students in class. And so a lot of assessment is informal assessment. It takes place during a class period. It could be the response that a teacher elicits from a student. It may be an entrance slip or an exit slip that a teacher uses to collect some information and then to refine a lesson. I'm sure many of you have heard teachers even talk about how they refine their lesson from the morning to the afternoon because they were able to collect some evidence on student performance and tweak that lesson. So those are certainly ways that assessment is used informally. And we really have three primary assessment types in the educational system in our country. And the reason I wanted to bring those to light tonight is you'll see the theme of those three assessments intertwined with the three assessments we'll speak to you about tonight. The first is a diagnostic tool, and anybody in almost any field is familiar with this word. And in education, we certainly use this word to look at what students are ready to learn. And you'll hear that theme when Ms. Fox speaks about the MAP assessment. And so that idea of MAP being a diagnostic tool that's used with students to find out their readiness levels so that teachers are able to design more effective instruction in the class. And then you have the most common assessment tool that's used in Berners Township, and that would be a formative assessment. This takes place almost daily. In fact, it does take place daily. And finally, a summative assessment, and this is certainly the assessment that the board has heard a lot about over the last year, and that would be the quarterly assessment as one example. And you'll actually see some types of assessments as I go through this. So just to speak to the formative assessment very briefly, the goal with a formative assessment is something certainly that happens very frequently. It tends to happen daily. It's also, hopefully, attempting to close the gap between the lesson plan that teacher writes, those objectives that a teacher writes, and then what the students are ultimately learning in class. And so sometimes there is a dissonance there, there's a disconnect there. And so it's the teacher's job then to help fill that void between the objective and what the students are exhibiting. And so that's done through feedback. That could be written feedback from the teacher. That might be peer feedback if students are working in groups. It might also be just verbal communication when you see a teacher walking around a room and providing feedback to students who are working individually or in groups. And the goal there is certainly that the teachers are modifying instruction, and throughout that unit, as we know it, the teachers are adapting and modifying. And so this is typically the cycle you see when you look at formative assessment. The teacher will write the lesson plan, and so you'll have objectives and goals that are set. This is why it's important for us as a district to have our curriculum posted for the public so that when a parent does have a question or a community member has a question, you can look at the objectives in our curriculum online to know ultimately what those anchors are helping students to learn. And then some type of instruction takes place. Typically, there is some direct instruction, but ultimately there's some inquiry where students are working in groups or working on a particular problem set, if it's in a math or a science class. And then that teacher is collecting some informal information from the lesson. And often then that phase of an informed teacher, where they have some information that they've observed from students. And it might be more tailored instruction, where you see students working in groups. Teachers may be working with a smaller group. You see this a lot in the elementary classrooms. Then the data that's collected, the teachers are looking at, and that data, again, could be informal observational data. It could be a quiz that was administered, and the teachers are modifying instruction and using the data, and the cycle begins again. And so some common formative assessments that certainly folks in the audience see coming home: teacher observations, as I've said; homework, generally speaking, is a formative assessment; lab reports, quizzes, and typically some informal in-class presentations as well. Now, the summative assessment usually is the assessment that gets the attention. The summative assessment is usually the assessment that is reported in the press. So, for instance, many of you who are reading some of the papers or the media saw the story last week about the SAT changes, right? That's a summative assessment that gets a lot of attention. And so it typically is viewed as the end of the race assessment, so meaning students are working toward a goal, and by taking that assessment, that signifies the end line or the finish line. The community at large refers to these as high-stakes assessments, and typically we like to think that it's a reflective tool for students and staff, although for many students they're just happy to be done with that unit, and so oftentimes they like to move on. But oftentimes a great deal can be learned from these assessments. And this is the other big distinction between a summative assessment and a formative assessment, in that the summative is really associated more with the product, the final product that student has exhibited. And so that's typically the performance or the score that they've received on that summative assessment, and then not as much of a concern with the process. That would be more of a formative assessment concern. And so I mentioned one of these already, but certainly an example of a summative assessment would be the SAT exam, AP exams. It wasn't that long ago we had midterms, final exams, the quarterly assessment, which you're going to hear more about in a couple of moments, and the PARCC assessments, which you'll hear about, and finally portfolios, which are becoming more and more common, particularly in our language arts classes. So with that in mind, one of the hot button issues, and an issue that the board has heard a lot about in the last year, last couple of years, and something that we've looked at, is this idea of a quarterly assessment, which would be a summative assessment. So Dr. Heineman is going to speak to that for a few minutes. I'll come back at the end to speak about some of our recommendations moving forward. Dr. Heineman?
Thank you very much, Mr. Syatt. As Mr. Syatt mentioned, quarterly assessments are a form of summative assessment, and I'm going to talk about these in the aspect or framework of them being a local assessment. So this is something that was developed internally. It's not a purchased product. It's not something from the state. This is our own internal product. And also they're common assessments. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. First, I want to start off with a little bit of historical context. So what brought us to the point where we're at today? So we know we have, at Ridge High School, we have quarterly assessments. And I was lucky enough to kind of go through the process, having been here for 10 years, that while I was here when midterms and finals were part of Ridge High School. And I wanted to give you a little bit of background. There was a student stressor survey done. This was 2011. That, in conjunction with some anecdotal evidence, led us as a district to have a goal of reducing student stress through the framework of assessments and homework. So to that end, a committee was formed. That committee had staff members as well as administration. Some pieces that I put up there, we showed Race to Nowhere. If you remember, that was a movie that was done. We showed pieces of that to staff. The PTO had pieces of that that they had for parents, that was played for parents. The students were surveyed. We conducted a Google survey. That assessment committee put together a survey, and that was done for the students at Ridge High School. Out of that survey, two pieces came out. From the homework side, the homework policy was revised, and that was done 2 years ago. So that still stands. The other piece was a move to go away from the midterm and final sessions that took place at Ridge to a common quarterly assessment. So that was the historical context that led us to where we are today, having these common quarterly assessments. So I wanted to give you a brief kind of look at that data. So this comes from that survey. So if you want to really focus, I guess, focus on the orange and grayish color. That's the side that shows you, did students feel like that midterm and final assessment were valuable to them? Did they feel like it had some benefit in the following year from students who went year to year in the school? And this was obviously freshmen were not surveyed because they didn't have the finals, so they were first year taking it. So if you look at this, basically, I'll go through it pretty quickly, but you can see, as I go through, that's language arts, it's mathematics, a little different. Social studies, science. I'll pause there for a second. So you can see that the students who disagreed or strongly disagreed in this particular instance is around 38%. Not too much different from those who agreed or strongly agreed, and then a whole bunch kind of in the middle who said, I'm not sure really what the effect was, it wasn't good, it wasn't bad, somewhere in the middle. So we know there was kind of a net, a slightly negative effect if you look at language arts, mathematics, and science, but overall the kids were kind of torn with this. So we also then put together this piece of data, which was, do students feel like their assessment on the midterm and final were similar to their grade that they were getting in the marking periods, right? So you have 4 marking period grades, you had a midterm grade, and a final assessment that counted separately into your final average for the course. And we were seeing if there was some parity between the grade they were getting on these exams and the grades they were getting for the 4 marking periods. And if you see the results of the survey, 46% of the students felt like the grades were lower, a large chunk of them felt like they were about the same, and a small portion, about 14%, felt like they did a little bit better, which could be the case. Some students do very well in assessments. Now, what is this data? It's a student assessment, right? So this was a survey done with students. So what is the validity of it? It is what it is. We needed to get input from students because their feelings, obviously, we have to take that into account. How do they feel the program is serving them? So what were the results when we looked at the data? So when we looked at actual assessment numbers, what did we see? So not a survey, but actual student data. These are scores I compiled from the averages of all CP courses. So I wanted to make you aware that I did pull out the scores for honors and AP courses because those were weighted scores. Okay, so if you look at the program studies right at the high school, those are weighted. So those scores were weighted in our e-school system. And so if I counted those in, it wouldn't really give you a true, although it's not apples to apples, at least similar fruit comparison between midterms and finals and quarterlies, which I'll show you in 2 slides. So in this you can see over 2011, 2012, it was just under 80. So generally students scored in a C plus, B minus range on average for their midterms and finals, okay? So that was 2011, 2012. So because of this, so we have the student data, we have the assessment results, we have student stressors that we're talking about, homework being adjusted, and now we have to come to a decision as a district, what are we going to do with these exams that we think we need to change? And so this was direct text, and I won't read it to you, you could look at it. This is direct text from the March 2nd letter sent home by Mr. Hallett regarding what would be the change to the Ridge exam schedule. So this is direct quoted text out of that memo that was sent home. And you'll see basically what it said was, we're going to do away with this midterm and final, these special periods that went along with that, and in its place, we're going to be placing common quarterly assessments. And that's 2 parts of that are important. The common part is really the most important. The quarterly part really is only telling you when it happens. And the fact that it's summative is just saying that it's at the end of a unit of study that's going to encapsulate all of that unit of study. So this is what was sent home. And after now going through it mostly for 2 years, because you'll see last year Sandy got in the way a little bit at the beginning of the year, so the first quarterly did not exist. So these are the averages for the quarterly exams for those courses. Now in this one it does include honors and AP courses, but they're not weighted. Okay, so this is, I'm looking at unweighted courses compared to unweighted, or unweighted quarterlies compared to unweighted midterms and finals. Now, that being said, can you really compare these? And the answer is no. Okay, it's for informational purposes. These scores are representative, but it's different students, different tests. It's just showing you what occurred. Okay, and in this case, over the past 5 quarterlies that were given, students average about 4 points higher, okay, on average on these exams as opposed to their midterms and finals when they took them. So what does the research say? So one of the important things to understand about common assessments, not just quarterlies, but common assessments, is that it ties into other things we're doing in the district. So this is not, it's not an isolated piece we pull out and say there's these tests, they're called quarterlies and all kids are going to take them. Part of what we're trying to do is establishing the collaborative environment here in Burns Township and working on something called PLCs, or professional learning communities. When you look into that study and look into the research done on building collaborative environments, part of the focus in education as a field is using common assessments to drive those discussions amongst educators. Okay? That's really the vehicle that we're hoping educators use, that our teachers use to improve instructions in the classroom. So having a common assessment is a critical piece. Okay, so I'll keep going, but a common assessment is a critical piece. These are, just some samples of research that's out there regarding PLCs. And whenever you look into that, the word you keep finding is common assessments. Common assessments, that's a critical piece. So what is the impact on instruction? If it's a common assessment, it's got better alignment of curricular goals across course sections. So if I was to teach the same course with 3 other teachers, the expectation in the district is that at the end of that course, the 4 of us would have the same outcomes, right? The students would have the same experience in that course. That's the expectation. Part of setting that expectation and following through it is having a common assessment amongst all those teachers. The second piece is that it's standards driven. This allows us to break down a standard, to unpack it, design assessments around it, to make sure we're testing what we're teaching, and that all the teachers are on the right page with that. And the last piece of the common assessment is that, as I mentioned, it matches our philosophy of PLCs, which we really started full steam ahead with last year, and it is a multi-year process. So what are the testing time requirements? So I'm comparing now, if you look at midterms and finals compared to quarterlies, there's an alternative schedule 4 times a year, so of course there is some time lost to that, but we know we lost time with midterms and finals as well. There's no financial cost. As I mentioned, this is developed internally. There's time for teachers. There's personal time that they spend creating these assessments, so there is lost time for that. And of course, when you look at quarterlies by themselves, there is lost instructional time to administer the quarterly exams. So, cost to value. Moving from midterm to final to quarterly was really kind of a wash. It's really hard to measure. We know that teachers did some preliminary preparation prior to quarterly or prior to midterms and finals, some review. We tried to build in less of that when we designed this, but we know that sometimes teachers will drift back and maybe do some review, so those days might not be moving forward with instruction. It's hard to measure that. We looked at the grades, and as I showed, there's about a 4-point swing, but really a pretty neutral effect on student grades. It's not really moving them one way or another too much different between a midterm and final or a quarterly. The value of the common assessment is, as I had previously mentioned, it is that benchmark and it's the focus for PLCs. So that allows teachers, that's the tool they can use to make sure all those things are taking place. So after consideration, the first part of this should already be known to most of you. The marking period 3 quarterlies have been canceled. So once again, Mother Nature has jumped in the way of our plans, the best laid plans. And it's not sandy, but it's a whole lot of snow over the past several months. Have led us to the point where we had to think of adjustments and consider alternatives. And in this case, we decided to cancel the marking period 3 quarterly. Marking period 4 quarterlies will take place as planned. We know that teachers had planned for, and we expect some sort of summative assessment to take place at the end of the marking period. It's unfortunate we couldn't do marking period 3, but we intend to do marking period 4 as planned. So, that being said, we do have recommendations for next year on this topic. This is ongoing. This is a process that we didn't, it's not something we put down 2 years ago after we made the implementation, said, no, they're ready to go. Their quarterlies are out there and we're going to walk away from it. We've been talking about this pretty much nonstop as we've rolled out the PLC process. How valuable are they? How could they be improved? The plan that we laid out that I showed you in that March 2nd memo from Mr. Hallett, how can we improve on that? That was the original plan. What iteration will be next that we can improve on this process? So the recommendation is as follows: to eliminate quarterlies in their current format, so as they stand now. Eliminate a quarterly schedule for marking periods 1, 2, and 3, so remain in a normal bell schedule right through the first 3 marking periods. Continue implementing common assessments. That's a critical piece. And so, what is a common assessment? Does it have to take place at the end of the marking period? No, it does not. A common assessment simply means we decide on a unit of study, we decide on an assessment that takes place at the end of that unit of study, and I, along with the teachers in my section, decide what that assessment looks like. We measure it together. We see how the results went, whether instructional strategies can be changed, if the curriculum aligns correctly, and that drives our decision-making process. So those will stay in place. Create an end-of-the-year summative assessment and a special bell schedule for the 4th marking period. And last but not least, continue collaboration between staff and the supervisor. We see this as a supervisory-driven process where the staff and teachers figure out what this looks like for each course. It'd be I think, disingenuous to say that a student in freshman year, biology is going to have, we want to give them the same exact experience as a senior student in an AP science class. They might be very different experiences depending on what that course looks like, the curriculum, state testing, other tests like AP test, all that has to be worked out. So before I hand off to the next speaker, I will say this is a recommendation. Okay, so this is something we'll be working towards for the next 6 months leading us into the next school year. So this is kind of number one on our agenda. And with that, I will hand it over to Mrs. Fox, who will talk to you more about MAP.
Thank you.
Mrs. Fox.
Thank you, Dr. Heineman. Good evening. So we're going to shift now to a national assessment, MAP, Measures of Academic Progress. Very different from the quarterly discussion. We implemented MAP testing in the spring of 2012 in grades 5 through 8. After that, we added grades 3 and 4, and we've now had 2 full years of implementation of the MAP assessment. MAP is very different than most of the assessments we use in Bernards Township, so here are some of its distinguishing characteristics. It is computer-based, so the students are taking the assessment on the computer. A very unique characteristic is that it is adaptive. What that means is that when the student answers a question correctly, the questions then become increasingly difficult. When a student answers the question incorrectly, they become less difficult. So the score that is generated or is calculated through the MAP tool is reflective of where the students are ready to learn, and it hones in very specifically on that readiness. In this way, it is a diagnostic tool that the teachers can use to drive instruction and make some unique decisions for individual or groups of students. MAP is a norm-referenced test, meaning it measures students' typical growth, so it doesn't tell us where students should be at the end of or at any learning stage. It tells us where they are typically for that group of students. And because the students take the same test every time, it allows us to measure their growth over time. MAP is not a measure of intelligence, and it is not summative, like we described with the quarterlies. It doesn't tell us what they know, it tells us what they're ready to learn. That's a very important difference. Because it's kind of useful to compare MAP directly to NJ Ask, because it kind of jumps out at you, the differences. Most importantly, is that MAP is an assessment for learning. It can be part of the learning process. You can use it diagnostically before, you can use it during, to make instructional decisions, whereas the NJ Ask is a summative assessment. It comes at the end of learning, like was described. So in that way, MAP focuses on student growth, whereas NJ Ask focuses on student achievement. So when we looked at bringing MAP to Bernards Township, we had several goals, the most important of which was looking for ways to improve student learning and using data, skill-specific data, that would allow teachers to make those decisions more frequently. But we also recognized there'd be a benefit in building student familiarity with computer-based assessments with the coming of the new state testing. And in addition, we thought it would be helpful to evaluate our program using data, as well as to inform some of our course placement decisions. So the company that provides MAP to us is Northwest Evaluation Association, which was founded in the 1970s, so it's been around for a long time. Their website, nwea.org, is a great resource to go if you want to learn more about MAP. They maintain a wealth of research and readings on what it is and how it can be used to drive instruction. So they have a database of all of the test items that they've ever used, or that they've used in the last 12 years, I should say. They work with institutions of higher learning to research and develop assessments. And then they produce studies every couple of years. 2 of them that are worth mentioning is a norming study that's done every 3 years, which is how they set the national norms for what is a typical score in grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And then they also produce state linking studies, which takes the student's MAP score and is a predictor of how they will perform on state testing. So, and it's proven to be very reliable when you can look at those state linking studies. So if you go to that website, you can see all of that research. So 5.1 million students take MAP every year across the country, and 187 New Jersey school districts are currently using it. It's increasing in how much it's being used. So MAP offers several tests in different subjects. We use 2. We test in reading and in mathematics, and those are the goals strands within each test that are tested. So to understand a MAP test and a MAP score, it's important to understand the scale that they use for the student score. It is called a Roche unit scale that's developed by a man named George Roche, who was a Danish mathematician. And he used a theory called item response theory to develop this scale. And the most important thing to know about this is that it is an equal interval scale and it is independent of grade level. So the easiest way to think about it is that it's like a ruler on the continuum of learning. It's like you're measuring a student's height, but you're measuring where they are on the continuum of learning. So if a student were to score between a 171 and a 180 on this math test, that would, in the second grade, that would mean the exact same thing if a student in 9th grade earned the same score. Because this would be the skills and concepts that they were ready to learn. So it's independent of grade level, which is very different than the achievement test. So think of it like inches and feet on a ruler, but applied to learning. A couple sample test items. This is a math test item, and you'll see that the students use the mouse to select an answer. They have to click on Go On at the bottom, and they can't click on Go On until they select an answer. If they can use a calculator, it will appear. They have the option of hiding the calculator. A sample reading question. Again, they have to use the mouse to select the answer and go on. If it's a longer reading passage, they may have to scroll down. So those are some of the computer skills that they need to take the test. Since we've implemented MAP, we've seen it used in some of these ways. Teachers are using it to make instructional decisions, to select reading materials that are matched to the students' reading scores, to create groups of different structures. So sometimes students will be mixed with a low, medium, and high RIT score in a particular subject, and sometimes students with a like score will be grouped together, depending on the lesson. And administrators, we're using it to analyze trends over time, not isolated scores, and to plan professional development based on data. So MAP reports come in a variety of formats. They're broken down in all of these ways, and I'm just going to show you a couple of the reports that are generated. This is a teacher report. Now, the teacher would have access to this report within 48 hours of the student taking the test. There's a lot on here, but I was just going to point out a few things. So this is a 7th grade math test taken last June. This is their student's RIT score, and it is listed from lowest to highest. So the teacher right away has the students kind of ranked from lowest to highest ability. And so that's their average RIT score on the math test. On the right, the scores are broken down further by goal strand. And you'll see in math there are 5 goal strands. So if you take a student over here with the score average of 229, that's their average RIT score, and you follow that over, you'll see that there are different scores by goal strand. Under goal strand A, which is numbers and operations, their score range on those particular test items fall between a 212 and a 227. So that is an area of weakness for students, numbers and operations. Whereas if you look at the same student, let me see if I can follow it, over here on goal strand E, mathematical processes, that's an area of strength because their score in that subset is higher than their average score. So that's some of the information available to teachers. Teachers also have access to a report of those same scores grouped by RIT score within each goal strand. So the teachers can use this to make groups or to select reading materials or to create lessons because they quickly have access to where the students' RIT ranges fall on different goal strands. At the end of the year, an individual student report is made available to parents, and on this, you will see every test event that that student has participated in. So you will be able to see their growth over time. It's kind of hard to see, but within here, you see the student's score for the winter of 13 was a 246. That's their individual score. You'll see the district average here, which was a 241, and then you'll see the national norm, which I think that says 229. So you can kind of put some context to what that score means at the end of the year. This chart of district MAP scores gives you another idea of how the RIT score works. The national norm is going to show you how the scores of a typical 3rd grader, the norm is a 190. Now what you'll notice is that, first of all, our district mean, that's our district average score, is significantly higher. And you'll notice that at each grade level. The scores are significantly higher, so our achievement, we're performing higher nationally by a pretty good range, because 3 to 4 RIT points can be significant growth. You'll also notice that the scores, this shows growth over time, increase each year. So again, it represents growth over time. And you'll notice that it grows a little less each year. So the most growth happens in the earliest grades. Now, so we see that our achievement is above the national norm, but we also see that our growth is fairly consistent with national growth. We're growing by pretty close to the same intervals each year. So those are our district scores this fall. So every year, well, so far, the students are tested twice in the fall and in the spring. They are tested in computer labs. It averages 50 minutes per test event, but it's untimed, so students may take less or more depending on their individual pace, and the students get data within 48 hours. The cost to the district is $13.50 per student, but in addition to the financial costs, we have to consider that it's time that the students are spending testing, the computer labs are blocked during that time, and then teachers and administrators are spending time analyzing the data. So we're constantly assessing the value of the testing and the data that it provides with all of these things. We do feel that the focus on student growth is really important, and we feel that it can contribute to student learning. We also see the benefit in giving students some experience with computer-based assessments with the coming of the new state testing. We also see a value in having an additional data point to use when making placement decisions across the entire learning spectrum. So there are those benefits, but we have to carefully weigh those against these. Oops, so sorry. I went to press the wrong button. Sorry, Matt. Oh, one more. Okay, sorry. Instructional time is the big one, the cost of it. But also, being new to MAP, we have to really carefully analyze the correlation between MAP, the test items, the scores, and the Common Core state standards. We're carefully evaluating this, and the future plans for MAP are a little uncertain. Our current plan, as we evaluate this impact, is to administer the test in the fall, so we would provide that diagnostic data to teachers to make instructional decisions at the beginning of the year. But we're going to decide about a spring administration when we have a little bit more information about the testing schedule next year, the new state testing schedule. And in the meantime, we'll continue to work with teachers to build their understanding of the RIT score and all those resources that I just showed you. Now it's your turn.
Thank you, Ms. Fox. So on to Park. So you've been hearing, you've probably seen in the media, state testing is changing for many states, including New Jersey, with the coming of the Park assessment. So Park, when we use this acronym, what we're talking about is the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers. And then along with this partnership, there is the Park assessment. So in order to understand why the test is changing, why the HSPA is changing, why the NJ-ASC is changing, and those sorts of things, I find it helpful to look back at the background and a little bit of historical context to see how we got to this point, what's wrong with what we currently have. So if we think back to 2008, the country was sliding into a recession. And governors all across the country were thinking about their states, and they were thinking about how can we bolster the economy of our states. Wisely, they realized that education played a major role in the economic viability of their state. And the governors, in their association, the National Governors Association, worked together with the Council of Chief State School Officers and a nonprofit group called Achieve NJ, which is concerned with educational reform, to study U.S. trends in education and international trends in education to look for best practices. What they found was that United States students needed a stronger foundation in mathematics and reading skills. They also needed to be better able to solve problems and to bring those problem-solving solutions to bear, and to understand when a problem-solving solution wasn't working, it's time to change it and try something new. Additionally, they realized that the world is becoming increasingly complex, and the types of communication that need to happen are becoming complex also, and that our students across the country needed to be able to communicate in many different formats. Additionally, the study found that in higher performing countries, they had higher standards per grade level, and also they had fewer standards per grade level, so that the teachers in those countries were able to better focus on those important learning outcomes and spend more time and get into them in a deeper way. This was all published in a report called Benchmarking for Success, Ensuring U.S. Students Receive a World-Class Education. Okay? So then in 2009, the National Governors Association convened the Common Core Standards Initiative. Okay? And this initiative had the goal of essentially upgrading the core standards in language arts and in mathematics, K-12. We wanted our students, or the Common Core Standards Initiative, their goal was to prepare students with those skills that they needed to be able to go out and be competitive in the global workforce. And once this Common Core Standards Initiative convened, initially 49 of 50 states signed on. Okay? So their guiding principles were the following, and I won't read this all, but I highlighted some of the important pieces here. The idea was to create a coherent staircase of skills, K-12, to prepare students with the knowledge they needed to be successful in entry-level college programs or vocational programs. They wanted it to be evidence-based, evidence supporting what was being taught in the mechanisms that learning was being imparted to the student, and to make sure that the things we were focused on are really the things that students need to be prepared for college, vocational schools, and careers. And they wanted to ensure that at each grade level, the standards were few enough in number so that teachers would have the time to teach them, okay, to develop deep understanding. What this became was the Common Core State Standards, which were released a few years ago, and I'm sure our board members are well aware of that because we've been doing a lot of curriculum work to become ready to be aligned with those standards. So they were released in June of 2010, and the standards were released for English, language arts, and mathematics. Okay? 45 states, the District of Columbia, U.S. territories, and the Department of Defense Education Activity have all adopted the Common Core State Standards, including New Jersey. So the Common Core State Standards for English, language arts, and mathematics have been adopted as New Jersey's state standards for those subjects. Now, when you have standards like this, it makes sense that we have to assess whether or not students are achieving them. So what has happened is 2 separate assessment consortia have formed. So we have the PARC Consortia, which is the one New Jersey's a part of, as well as 16 other states, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The other one is you may have also seen in the media, is a consortia called Smarter Balanced. And there are 23 states currently in the Smarter Balanced Consortia. Now these numbers keep changing, and so this information is as up to date as we can offer. You may go and look on the internet tomorrow and say, hey, there's only 16 states in PARC or 21 states in Smarter Balanced. It's changing all the time. Okay? So what is this PARC thing that we're a part of as New Jersey? As I mentioned before, it's the Partnership for the Assessment of Readiness for College and Careers. It's this assessment consortia that New Jersey's a part of. And the idea is to create high-quality assessments to support our students, to make sure our students are ready for college and careers, and that all students are ready. And in 2010, the PARC Consortia was awarded one of those Race to the Top grants that you may have heard about, and they were awarded a $186 million grant to develop a PARC assessment with the purpose of measuring student achievement in the Common Core State Standards. So the PARC assessment, some features. Now this is not a test that we have seen. It's not a live test, and it doesn't go live until next year. But we're learning about it, we're preparing for it, and our goal is to make sure that Bernards Township is ready when the park assessment goes live next year. We know it will be computer-based. We know it is aligned to the Common Core state standards. It will be measuring student achievement in English language arts and mathematics, not social studies or science or anything else, but those two areas. Similar to the New Jersey Ask or the high school proficiency assessment. Now, one of the differences is the park assessment will be administered to students in grades 3 through 11. So that means 9th and 10th graders will also take this assessment. And that's not something that's currently happening. And a key idea here, which is in bold, it will replace the New Jersey Ask and the HSPA next year. Okay? Now, the exception to that is, you may know that the New Jersey Ask, there's a 4th and 8th grade science assessment. Well, the park assessment is only measuring achievement in language arts and mathematics, so that we will continue, we just found out actually last week, we will continue to administer the 4th and 8th grade New Jersey Ask for science only next year. Okay, and that will be a paper-based test, not a computerized test. Okay? Now, one thing that we're preparing for right now is a field assessment, a field test of the park assessment, which will begin at the end of this month, where on a small scale, we can administer a modified version, a field test version of the park assessment to our students for the purpose of making sure that our infrastructure and our technology is ready for this assessment. And it also allows our state and the park consortia to test out some of their questions and make sure that the technology's working right and to gather some initial data on how students will do in interacting with this brand new testing system. Okay, so the park assessment, there's a design to it, okay, and there are multiple parts to this park assessment. You'll see in the graphic up here that there are 4 main parts, and then there's one at the bottom. Some of them are in gray, some of them are in black. Okay, so I'll explain what all that means. So starting next year, there will be the first live administration of 2 parts of the park assessment. They will be the 2 parts which will become the required mandatory state testing. So what's intended is that 75% of the way through the school year, students will, or it will be administered to students, a performance-based assessment, which we're calling the PBA, everybody's calling the PBA. And then at a 90% through the year will be an end-of-the-year assessment. Now the scores from those 2 assessments, they will go together to form the student's score. So, you know, whether or not the child was proficient or not with the state standards at their grade level standards will be determined based on the results of those 2 tests. Now the 2 in black here, the PBA and the end of year, the EOY, those are the 2 tests that will be live next year. And from here on out until something new comes along, these will be the state tests for us. Now, next year, they will also be field testing a 3rd component, which is called the speaking and listening component. And it's an English language arts assessment. And that will not be a live component next year. Okay, but presumably the following year, that will be another required part. Now, it won't be ready for next year, but we're being told that the following year, there will be 2 optional components to the park assessment that districts can opt to administer to students or not based on their local needs. And that's a beginning of the year diagnostic assessment and then a sort of a mid-year assessment. Okay, I guess that's why it's called a mid-year assessment. All right, and it will be very similar to the performance-based assessment. But you can see that this is very, very different, right? We have the New Jersey Ask once a year, and we have the high school proficiency assessment once a year. Now we're talking about next year a minimum of 2 assessments for students in grades 3 through 11. Okay? So what's the research base behind all of this and thinking about, where did this all come from? Well, in understanding the research base behind the PARCC assessment, what we're really doing is we're looking at the research base behind the Common Core State Standards, because this is a tool for measuring achievement in those areas. And so the Common Core State Standards were developed based on the findings of much scholarly research, surveys of skills important for workplace readiness, and assessment data related to college and career-ready performance. It's probably not a surprise to you that many students, when they get to college, they have to go through sort of remediation courses in order to be ready to learn, and that's a problem. And so there's data that's sort of driving that piece of it. Looking at the curricular standards of the highest performing nations around the world, that's driving this, and also the NAEP frameworks, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. That's a nationwide test that measures select students from across the country to see how they're comparing to one another with regard to achievement. And it drew upon, specifically for mathematics, the TIMSS study. And the TIMSS study is the Trends in International Math and Science study. These are the studies when you see those rankings in the news of how the US is falling behind everybody. These are those studies that are being cited in those reports. Okay, so how will the PARCC assessment be used? So we know that the intent of the PARCC assessment is to determine whether or not students are on track. Okay, and by on track I mean, are they going to be ready by the end of their educational experience with us? Are they going to be ready for college, career, some sort of vocational training? It's connected to the Common Core State Standards. It's intended to measure achievement in the Common Core State Standards. And it's intended to measure the full range of all student performance, including the very low performing student and the very high performing student, which honestly is something that the New Jersey Ask in the high school proficiency assessment is not very good at, which is one of the reasons why the state has recognized we need to change that. And it's intended to provide educators with the data we need throughout the year to inform instruction, and that's a trend. That's really the purpose of assessment, right? We want to inform instruction and document achievement. Okay? So the test is not live. It's not something that there's a real life PARCC that we can go and look at and give you samples, but we do have access to some sample questions and some mock-ups of sample questions to get a sense of how the PARCC assessment is going to be different than some of these other tests. And these other tests are similar to the ones that we probably remember when we were in school, where you fill in a little bubble with the number 2 pencil, and you got to make sure you color in the circle, and you can guess or work backwards sometimes and get an answer. So it's computerized, and the PARCC assessment is leveraging technology to try to eliminate some of those inconsistencies with regular testing, right? The ability to just guess and maybe get a lot of the questions right. So you can see this is a 3rd grade item. I'm not going to ask you the answer, so if you don't know, don't worry. Okay? And so the idea here is that a student needs to figure out in 3rd grade, or they need to demonstrate that they understand what 3/4 means, right? So they have to drag the bean on the computer screen and put it in the little areas in the field, the quadrants in the field, and fill in 3/4. Now, does it matter if they fill in the top half or the bottom half or the side? It doesn't matter as long as it's right. Okay? So it's not, I'm going to guess B, and maybe it's going to be right, maybe it's not. I have to demonstrate that I really know what's going on here. Okay? So here's a follow-up, a part B of that same question. Now we have to write the fraction in a different way so that it has the same value, right? So what it's getting at here is 6/8, right? But what if the student wrote 12/16? Well, it would still be right. So it allows a student to demonstrate their knowledge in a variety of ways as long as it's still right, okay? And they can't work backwards, right? It's not like they're going to have 4 different fractions and I'm going to work backwards until one of them makes sense. And I really don't know what it is, but I know how to eliminate or something like that. It's going to measure whether or not the student really understands that, okay? Here's another, this is a high school example that has 2 possible solutions. Well, you don't see that on the high school proficiency assessment. There's a right answer. There's one right answer, and it's one of the ones that you bubble in. Okay? Here's a language arts section. And in this sample, students read text about a topic. In this case, they're reading about Amelia Earhart, her biography. And then the items are designed to help students gather information from the text to lead to their final writing prompt, okay, rather than just start writing, okay? So as we follow up here, it's pretty cool because one of the things that they'll need to do is highlight claims, okay? And then click on 2 facts that provide evidence to support the claim in part 1. So again, not guessing, we have to click on some facts here. So I have to know where in the body of the text there's facts that are supporting this claim. Okay? So here's some more. Okay, now all of a sudden I have to write an essay. And I'm going to type it right in there. Okay. So I jumped ahead a little bit. All right, so now let's think about one of the things that goes along with assessments is, you know, they give us data, but guess what? They take time. So how much time is the PARCC assessment going to take? Well, the real answer is we don't know, but we know how long the field test is going to take. And the guidance we've been given is it will be similar to that of the field test unless the field test gives us data that we either have too much time or not enough time. Okay, so this is our best information. If I'm wrong, don't yell at me later. Okay, so here's our elementary. You will see for 3rd grade, the performance-based assessment next year will be marked, we have a window, sometime between March 2nd and March 27th. We'll administer this, and there are 5 sections. Okay? So once we sort of learn how to read this chart, then I'll go through the other ones more quickly. Language arts has 3 sections, a literacy analysis, research, and narrative section. These are in minutes, how long it's estimated it will take or how long it's designed to take. Then mathematics has 2 sections. So for 3rd grade, you're looking at a performance-based, a total testing time of 250 minutes. The end of year assessment for 3rd graders has 4 sections, 2 language arts, and 2 mathematics, okay? And so you can see these here. So the total testing time for 3rd grade, they're estimating 8 hours, okay, over the course of the year, these 2 windows. The end of year testing window, we know now, as of last week, will be April 27th through May 22nd. So we have that period of time to make sure all of our 3rd graders get to take the test, okay? So 4th and 5th grade, you can see, same structure to the test, same sections, but they're a little bit longer now. Okay, so total time, 9 hours and 20 minutes. Okay, middle school. Now, middle school 6 through 8, we have the same timing for all 3 grades. Okay, same testing windows. So we're going to be getting all of our all of our 3rd through 11th graders. You're going to see, I'm giving away the surprise ending. High school has the same testing window too. We have to get all of those students through our testing window, the performance base, March 2nd through March 27th, and then the end of year, April 27th through May 22nd. And here we have the high school piece. Now the high school piece is a little bit different with math. Okay, so language arts, we see the same 3 sections, and language arts will be administered 9th grade language arts, 10th grade language arts, 11th grade language arts. Now math is by course. When you get up to the high school grades, it's by course. So there'll be an Algebra 1 test, end of course type test, a geometry, and then an Algebra 2. Okay? So what we've been told recently, and we have been asking this question quite a bit, is, hey, what happens if our 8th graders are taking Algebra 1? Or in some cases, our 7th graders? Well, guess what? If they're taking Algebra 1, they take the Algebra 1 test. So what does that mean when they're in 11th grade and they're taking calculus? Then they wouldn't take a PARCC assessment for math at that time. Okay. Okay, so what's this going to cost us to do? All right? So here are our anticipated costs. And keep in mind, this is the new state testing. This is not our crazy idea to do. Okay? So we need to upgrade our wireless infrastructure to be able to assess all of the students within these windows. So our anticipated cost there would be $235,000. That's to, change out or put in access points and all of that hardware technology that you would need to have the students connected to the internet in order to take the test. It's an online test. We'll need to upgrade our bandwidth capacity because testing that many students would use up all of our bandwidth. We would crush our network. So we'll need to increase the capacity. And then we need devices for the students to take the test on. So we're looking at various models of what's the number of devices we would need to get through the testing windows with all of our children. Okay? So these are our estimates. Now the good news is the state is granting districts some money. I'm being optimistic.
I think you left the zero.
So they are granting us some money. Clearly they're not going to grant us all of the money we need to make this happen. Now, one thing to note here in these estimates is this is not a yearly kind of thing that every year we're going to need to spend this kind of thing, and it's only for parks. So obviously if we had increased networks, we had more devices, we have a better wireless, well then there are other things that can happen, right? Because we have these testing windows, but then all of that stuff's still there the rest of the year. So it could be used to support the instructional programs in the different schools. So there is that, but I recognize that that's a big number, and it's this is sort of scary. Okay, so there are some other potential costs to the district that are harder to quantify. Okay, we can look up and say, okay, what's the cheapest device that we can put kids on to take this test? How much of those? How many do we need? That's easy to figure out. What's harder to figure out is what happens if we have to move a fleet of assessment computers around the district, if that's the most efficient way to do this. So if we get, bless you, less devices, well, if we can move them around, then more kids can take the test on them. What's that going to cost? I put a little star there because we're looking for strategies where that's not necessary, okay, where we wouldn't have to do that. So looking at efficiencies there. What's it going to cost to secure the devices when they're not in use? Make sure they don't all walk away and then we have to come back and say, hey, we need more. What's the cost in hours to inspect and maintain the fleet of devices, okay, of our assessment devices? What's the cost to train our technicians and to train the proctors who are going to be administering this test? Okay, certainly there's a cost in time, but there may also be a cost in actual money to train them. And then of course, our biggest concern, or I won't say our biggest, one of our concerns is the lost days of instruction. Because you'll recognize there is more testing and more time needed than the test that this is replacing. Okay? So this is, one thing to understand is, this is New Jersey's new state test, right? This is not something that, that we just decided, hey, let's do this. Okay. So what will this mean for high school graduation? I know people are concerned about this. The HSPA is going away. What does this mean for graduation? I have kids in the district. This park test, it's something we don't know about. What's this mean? Now, honestly, the real answer is we don't know what it's going to mean for high school graduation. We just don't, because the state doesn't know what it's going to mean for high school graduation yet. They haven't decided. But I can tell you what we do know, okay? If we look at the College and Career Ready Task Force for New Jersey, they outlined some basic guidelines in the assessment transition. And so we can infer from that what the thinking of the state is, because they haven't come out and said, hey, it's going to count in X year. They've made some hints and things like that. But what they have said is that in initial years, as this test is brand new, as norms are being established, as the questions are being evaluated to make sure that they're really measuring what they're intended to measure, It's not going to count as a high school graduation requirement. What this means is the testing requirement for graduation is going to go away next year. And it's going to go away for a period of time. We don't know what that period of time is. We've been told at least until 2016. Okay? And at that point, the state's going to evaluate the data and determine where those cuts are, because they need to determine what's passing and what's not passing, right? And the way that works is they need a body of data to look at to make those decisions. And of course, the state assures us that they're going to undertake a long and thoughtful process to make these determinations. Now, in a press conference, Governor Christie also mentioned in 2012, I think it was April 30th, if you go back and look at his press conferences, and I think he was at West Windsor Plainsboro School when he said it. He referred to, at that time, that he said this year's fourth graders, it will count. And so if you walk that forward, it would count when they're in ninth grade, and if what he said it was still the thinking of the state, that would be the class of 2020. Okay? So that's speculation. I wouldn't, don't go to Atlantic City and bet on that 2020. But, that may be what we're talking about. And we, of course, will keep the community up to date as we find out more. Okay? All right, so I'm going to turn the microphone back over to Mr. Syatt, who's going to bring this all together.
Try. Thanks, Mr. Hall. So that's a lot to digest. You can see that one of the things we're trying to do is to stay ahead of the curve, and I think that's evidenced by some of the information that Mr. Hall presented. I know we've really tried to do our best. We've been in communication with the Department of Education over the last few weeks and months, and we've already started to plan for the infrastructure and for the implementation. I can tell you we've had many, many meetings, and our goal really is to minimize the impact on instruction. We want to make sure that we are conducting the test in the most efficient fashion possible so that we are not taking time away from our students, and continue to make sure that those students are getting all the instruction that's possible. So with that in mind, one of the things that you can draw out of this presentation is that when you look back at the last hour and 15 minutes, which might seem like it's been longer than that, but it's been about an hour and 15 minutes, you can see that we have a test currently that's locally developed, and that's the quarterly assessment, and we certainly have a lot of control there. So our focus of control is great, meaning we can certainly tweak and modify as we feel is needed based on the performance of students and other factors as been suggested. MAP, we feel, is a beneficial assessment tool, and certainly we're going to look at the benefit versus the lost instructional time, and this final piece, PARC, and what that impact will be on the assessment and also on the instructional time. So we want to make sure that all the assessment that we use in Berners Township is purposeful, and so that's why our focus first is to look at the quarterly assessment and also this idea of common assessments. And so, so much for those animations. So one of the things that we're going to look at is the grade 6 to 8. We feel like there's a lot of benefits in a common assessment. Now, the idea of a common assessment is one that you can certainly benchmark classes, meaning you can look at all students taking one class and expect to see similar results, so that if you're not seeing similar results, you can start to look at curricular changes that may need to be made, and also look at individual differences in student population. So we see a lot of benefits there, so this could be a possible long-term consideration, not modifying the schedule at all at Annan, but perhaps building in some common assessments. Now, I can share with you that Annan teachers, many of them already use common assessments, but this could be a philosophy that we look at. Again, thoughts for consideration, not something that's right now in the planning phase, but this could be something we look at, because we do think there are a lot of benefits to the common assessment overall. And I think that's one of the things that we hope folks can separate out, the idea of a quarterly from a common assessment. The common assessment in of itself can be very beneficial. It does not mean that you have to modify the schedule to conduct a common assessment, and I think that's one of the things that we have to look at. And so the other thing that we also realize is we have a whole host of assessments that are really effective in the district, and they are not necessarily the assessments of our grandparents or our parents. They are performance-based assessments that will also prepare students for some of the national assessments. And so those are some assessments taking place at Rich High School that I've I had the pleasure to sit in on over the last couple of weeks, Socratic seminars, scored discussions, document-based question administration. These are assessments which are relevant, but don't necessarily afford the most flexibility in our current high school schedule. So that might be something that we consider looking at down the road. Yes, I said looking at the high school schedule. Again, down the road. I was up here a few years ago talking about that. The other thing that we would certainly look at, and I know that Dr. Heineman referenced this, that is this idea of looking at embedding these common assessments. So instead of having a separate bell schedule, where you do have a somewhat chaotic schedule where teachers are administering quarterlies, assigning new homework, sometimes testing in that same class during the week. We have a more cohesive schedule, so a traditional schedule, but you still administer these assessments that are modified on the current high school schedule, so using the current 42-minute schedule at the high school. Because again, we do see a lot of benefit in these assessments. The other thing we might look at then is an idea of to still mimic that high-stakes assessment locally. Because remember now, the high-stakes assessment that Mr. Hall referenced is not within our control. That is that national and state assessment to Park. But we still would like to mimic the high-stakes assessment locally. And so to create or to use some type of a summative common assessment at the end of the year, whereby we look at perhaps just a modified schedule, the fourth marking period only. Again, a consideration to look at, not something we'd be looking at for this year. And then the other thing that is interesting, especially in the context of MAP as a diagnostic tool, is the Park pre-assessment tools that Mr. Hall referenced. We do not know yet what they look like, but there are a lot of benefits for us to looking at those, especially considering we know we're going to be administering the Park assessments already. And so it would behoove us to look at the benefits of administering those diagnostic tools that Park will provide. Again, those are optional. Those are not available yet. Those are not even being field tested yet, but that's something that we would like to look at. And at that point, we will have gone through several cycles of MAP and be able to make a determination about how beneficial those results are. I can tell you that it's really taken, as Ms. Fox referenced, a couple of years for staff to start to use that data, become familiar with the data, and it's something we still need to familiarize the community with more. But again, those are some considerations as we look at this really complex picture of assessment, and again, not something that is easily solved in an hour and 20-minute presentation, but something that we wanted to give you a flavor for. These are really the three major assessments facing us as a district, and again, some long-term considerations that we would look at over the next 3 to 5 years. Some even as soon as next year. But at this point, I'm going to open it up to board questions, so I'll turn it over to Ms. McEwen to moderate. If you want to, I don't know if you want the mic. Yeah. Then I'll invite everybody up. Yeah, there was one.
Okay, as I pointed out before, if you came in late, this is an opportunity for the Board of Education members to ask questions to the administrators. If you have any comments, you can save them for when we have public comment in a little while. So, who wants to go first? Bev?
I have lots of questions, but
Do you want the mic so the audience can hear you?
I have a lot of questions, but let's break it down piece by piece. So, and I'm sure a lot of my colleagues have the same questions I do. So let's start with what we can control, which is our in-house testing. So regarding these common assessments, would they have the value of a regular examination? Would they be administered on the same day to every student who's taking that common assessment, or are we not ready to answer those questions yet?
I think the idea would be that they would be just a normal part of the curriculum. So as an example, take a course. If the four of us were teaching college prep mathematical biology, we might say, well, what are the strands in biology we think are important? What did the kids struggle with in the past? Let's pick, say, genetics. Mendelian genetics has always been trouble for kids. Okay, let's look at our end of unit assessment for that. Let's make that our common assessment. When does it take place? It takes place where it always took place, during the marking period. So if we find that's the most critical piece, that would be something we would work with Mr. Hall as our supervisor. That would be what we identify as one of our critical strands in the standards, and therefore that's what we would choose to make one of our common assessments. Its value would be just like that test's value was every year. So once again, the goal is that we're going to have that common assessment instead of 4 different assessments to make sure we're getting all the benefit out of the assessment itself. So that's really the kind of the big difference from a quarterly summative assessment versus, or a quarterly common assessment versus just a common assessment as it was built into it, the idea of a PLC.
Okay. And would an effort be made that all of the different teachers giving the same assessment would administer it on the same day, or would it probably be staggered through like a week-long period?
We haven't really talked much about that. I mean, you could really probably go either way with that, I would think. The reality is that could be something, as I think Sean mentioned, you could have common assessments happening right now at the middle school level and maybe not even know. There are teachers who simply like working together and say, hey, why don't we make this test, and are giving a common assessment and looking at it. And so we want to move more in that direction and away from this idea of it's only at the end of every quarter, that's the only time we see these common assessments.
Okay.
If I could just piggyback on that for a second. I think one of the things that we've been looking a lot at in general is just the issue of time and the overall amount of time that we have available to get everything done. And one of the things that you look at in the current arrangement is that you've got a range of assessments that teachers are using to accomplish a given course. In the past, they had that range of assessments, exams, quizzes, tests, and so on, and they were giving a midterm and a final exam. So call it regular assessments plus 2. Now they've got regular assessments plus 4 because they have 4 quarterly assessments. When we look ahead to what we anticipate is coming at us next year with the park, if you saw the amount of time that's involved, each of those sessions that Mr. Hall pointed out is an individual day. You can't bang out 5 sessions in a day, obviously. So you're looking at testing kids for 4 or 5 days straight in order to get those sessions of tests done. Obviously, that's going to take a lot of time. One of the considerations that we really are trying to achieve in looking at how we're going to use common assessments, how we're doing assessments in general, and getting away from doing the quarterly assessment schedule, all right? Remember, you have common assessments and you have quarterlies. Quarterlies, as we've been using them the last 2 years, have been common assessments done at a certain time through a certain schedule. We have to remove that if we're going to have any chance of being able to manage the impact of park next year. That's one of the other major drivers in marking periods 1, 2, and 3, not having special schedules for quarterly assessments. So in the context of a quarterly assessment, as we know them today, just forget it. It's out of your mind. What you want to keep from that is the commonality and maybe some of the content of that quarterly that gets used some other way. Maybe it's towards the end of a marking period, maybe it isn't. As far as marking periods 1, 2, and 3 are concerned, think of every test as just being another test. It's worth what a test is typically worth for that given class. How much time it takes, we're only going to do 40-minute periods. We're going to keep it simple all the way through the school year so that we can best bob and weave and react to whatever we're going to have to do with park, and we don't know what that's going to look like yet. So we really need to be able to be light on our feet, and having a quarterly schedule every 9 weeks does not make you light on your feet and help you be able to respond to park. So that's not going to happen. We're going to have to do regular assessments. So as far as how much is it worth, it's worth what a test is typically worth in that class. As far as when is it going to be administered, it's when the teacher would have normally administered whatever unit test they were giving at that time. We really want the supervisors to start playing a key role in working with their staff, in working with them to take a look at which courses, where do the common assessments fall, can we look at maybe when a unit test would have landed and maybe modify that a little bit so that we could capture a little bit more information with this assessment, but it's just a test and it's worth a test. As far as the end of the year assessments go, what are those end of the year assessments going to be worth? Which courses are going to have end of the year assessments? The considerations on stress overall next year are not lost on us when we look at this. So we want to make sure that with all of the data that we have regarding the students who apparently did not really like midterms and final exams, based on the data that we got, big surprise, right? They don't want to take these big tests any more than any of us wanted to take midterms and finals when we were in college. How much fun was that? It wasn't any fun, right? So, we have to temper that information. But at the same time, if you take away quarterly assessments, and we say that the PARCC test has no graduation requirement, where's the skin in the game for the kid? When are they going to have that experience of what it's like to take a complete end-of-year assessment so they at least have some idea of what it's like to prepare for something where they've got to review a course set of material and take some exam that has some pressure on it? Okay, of course, we don't want to overwhelm the kids with pressure, but they have to experience some pressure. There is pressure in life. There is pressure in taking exams. There's going to be pressure in assignments and tests that they have to do in college. So the idea of the end of the year assessment is to forego the quarterly schedule, save that time, and just have an opportunity at the end of the year in some courses selected by the collaboration of department chair people and their staff to decide, okay, which courses does it really make sense to give an end of the year assessment in? Which isn't to say that at the end of any given year, teachers aren't going to give their last test of the year. Of course, there's going to be the last test of the year. The question is, which of those assessments do we want to make into significant end-of-year summative assessments that are worth more than just one test? Maybe you make it worth a double test. What we're thinking is somewhere in the range of 5 to 10% of the entire course. Final exams were never more than 10% of a course in a typical year-long course. So if we have a test that teachers typically give over the course of the year that's maybe it's worth 80 or 100 points, when we make a custom schedule for the end of the year and we give that teacher a double period, they could administer something that was maybe worth twice that, 160, 200 points. So we think if we work with the teachers in that way, we can create a situation that's maybe worth 5 to 10% of the student's grade. So you are creating that situation where they have to prepare for a high stakes test, and you're also giving them the opportunity to see what that might be like, because they will have to do it sooner or later in college. The other idea that we've talked about to manage the stress issue is to work to look at what's a typical freshman going to experience at the end of their freshman year. What's a typical sophomore going to experience? A typical junior? So if you take a look at what are the courses that kids typically take as freshmen, sophomores, and juniors, and you're selective about which courses you're going to have an end-of-the-year assessment in, aka a final exam of sorts, then you can also manage the stress by the number of final exams that you ask the kids to take. If a typical kid has these 6 courses in their schedule as a freshman, and you designate 2 of them to have this double test, if you will, it should help manage the stress that the kids are going to experience at the end of the year. So that's what we're thinking about the weight of the tests.
All right. Should I give someone else an opportunity to ask, or should I got a lot of questions. Keep going. I have one question about the MAP test. I know when we compare our district scores to others or every other district in the state of New Jersey, who are
Nationally.
the NJASC?
Oh, no, MAP or NJS?
NJASC. I know we're comparing to every other district in
Correct,
New Jersey. When we're comparing our average to a MAP average, who are the others in that group we're comparing ourselves to?
Every student in the nation who takes it at that grade level.
But
So
can
there
we
is no-
assume it's across all socioeconomic
Yes,
levels? Okay, all right, that's what I wanted to know. All right. The rest of my questions are about PARCC, and I want to thank Mr. Hull for doing a very good job in presenting some very challenging things that are coming up. My first question is, in getting all the news feeds from the School Board Association in the state, I'm hearing some inklings that they may not be ready next year, and it might not be happening. So do we have a contingency plan if there is no PARCC next year? Do we have any kind of testing lined up, or are we just going to have a happy year with no standardized testing? Which I wouldn't mind, just curious.
We have not received any hint from the state that the PARCC will not be live next year. In fact, they have been very clear in saying the PARCC will be live next year. Make sure you're ready for the PARCC next year, and go forth and do everything you need to do.
Okay. So, that being said, and, it really worries me because I feel like we're on top of things, and if we have to pull it together, we will, but there's a lot of districts out there that I think are really behind the 8 ball on this. But if we're able to get all the equipment and administer it, first of all, I'm concerned about leveling for the students. Whatever technology we choose, say we choose a point and move technology like on a tablet, how are we going to get the kids who are using a mouse at home familiar with that technology before the testing so they're on an even playing field? If the essay is typing in, how are we going to get the kids who do their essays at home by hand up to speed and comfortable to test on an even playing field by typing?
So you ask a lot of good questions, and these are all the same types of questions that we're asking ourselves. We've started looking at information is coming out every week. In fact, they have a bi-weekly newsletter that comes out from Park every week, and we go through those. What's the latest? And it really is coming fast and furious. As the state looks at this as we have a year before it goes live, and they're looking a year out. We're also concerned because we're participating in the field test, so we want to make sure that the field test, we're ready for the field test so that we can glean whatever information possible from the field test to gauge our own readiness and to make sure that our students aren't completely confused about how to do this and those sorts of things. So we're looking at it. I know Kristen Wolf and Dave Hunter with their departments at the last month's department meeting, they went through what samples were released to start familiarizing the teachers with these are the types of questions that we've been given to start to see how the questions are organized. What sorts of tasks are students going to need to do? We're field testing specific devices because there's a cost issue, right? So we're not going out and saying, okay, what's the best possible device that we can get to take Park on? We're saying, what's the most economically responsible device that will also serve other functions besides just taking a test? And how do we familiarize students with it?
Jump in on that too.
Sure.
So I think that's a really good point, is the idea of accommodations. It's kind of one of the questions, different kids taking the test in different ways. And the range of accommodations we didn't even really get into because that's almost a separate presentation in and of itself about how the different accommodations for both regular education and special education students are going to work because there are accommodations for both. Standard accommodations regardless of whether you're classified and then other accommodations if you have an IEP with special needs. So as Mr. Hall pointed out, those things are coming out steadily and we're working on reviewing those with our special services teams to try to make sure that they're up to speed and making necessary accommodations accordingly when we start to do this next year. The other thing is the items, and you talked about the kids. How are we going to make sure the kids are going to be ready? The device that they're using. So I think one of the things that's important is that we start to get those devices into the hands of the kids early on next year so that once we make our final decision about what we're going to be doing with purchasing and which devices we expect the kids to take the test on, which are probably going to be Chromebooks, we start getting those things into the hands of the kids. And we start letting the kids use those in classrooms as they might a laptop cart or an experience down in the computer lab. Instead, you pass these out and they could do a little research on it. They could do some writing on it. They can get themselves familiar with how to use this particular device. We think that that's going to be important to do. We also know that the items themselves are going to be available for students to try. If you, as parents, you want to go online right now and Google Park sample items, it'll take you to the Park website and they've already posted sample items that you can actually try as computer-based items. Which isn't to say that you want to spend the weekend doing that with your kids, but it's something that you could certainly do if you want to start seeing what it looks like. I was at a meeting on Friday, county roundtable meeting of superintendents, and we had one of the folks from Trenton there talking to us. And like I do at every meeting that I get the chance to ask, where there's a representative from Trenton there, I say, "So are we definitely doing Park next year?" And yes. The answer has been yes every time, as Mr. Hall suggested. They keep saying that this is definitely going to happen. So we're certainly not resting on our laurels saying, oh, they're going to change their mind. They're just going to keep it the NJ ask, which isn't to say that is 100% out of the realm of the possibility, but they say that it is, that that's not going to happen, that we're going to be doing Park. So we have to proceed accordingly.
Okay. And then just one final question, and I'm not sure we're ready to answer this yet. I think we're going to have to talk about this in more detail in curriculum. But the amount of hours required to get through these tests, 8, 9, almost 10 hours for an 11th grader, what impact is that going to have on our real curriculum and teaching? Because especially when you look at an elementary level, you can't crank it all out in a couple of school days. Elementary school students have a very limited capacity for focusing on something. We're going to have to spread it out over a week or longer. I'm not sure we have an answer for this yet, but I'm really worried about the impact on the curriculum. You wanna?
I can speak to that a little bit. So that's our biggest challenge, is not just the test itself and all the technical issues, which are vast, in trying to make sure this is actually going to work, but also how we're going to administer it. Assuming all the technology works and the question comes up the way they need to, and we have all the accommodations in place, how are we actually going to administer this thing in our schools? And how much technology do we need to get that actual administration done? How much time is it going to take? And how are we going to minimize lost instructional time? So we have been having this issue come up at basically every meeting that we're having this year, where I'm constantly challenging the principals and the guidance teams and Mr. Hall, who's our testing coordinator. I want you to find the way that's going to disrupt the instruction the least, given this number of testing devices. And that's a really big challenge. I anticipate that we'll have to see some creative scheduling. We may have to create some unusual testing environments, bringing in some tables, similar to what we might do when we administer the SAT here on the weekends, where you have to set up an area where you can test more students at the same time, so that you can use your classrooms, because facilities are going to be an issue. Keep in mind that when we give the HSPA to the juniors, the rest of the kids come in late. We need the whole building and all the staff to test just the 11th grade students. Now we have to test the 9th and the 10th grade students as well. That's, this is, not to overstate it, but this is huge, okay? And not to create panic, okay? Because we will find a way. It's going to be okay. Somehow it will be okay. We will survive. I believe, I have faith that, we're not given any challenges we can't overcome. So we will find a way to overcome. But it's going to be challenging, and it's going to have bumps in the road, and definitely the lost instructional time is a big, big consideration. And how are we going to find some ways to keep instruction going while we get this test done? We don't have the final answer yet, but we are constantly working on it. Poor Mr. Hallett, right? The first day back after being out sick, the first thing he says is, how am I going to get this testing done? And I said, I don't know, ask Gina Tenga, she'll figure it out for you. So we know that's a major challenge. Yeah.
I had the same questions as Bev, but I have one that's related, and it has to do with this budget item for the park testing. So you've budgeted, this amount of money, and I guess my question is, I'm looking at these testing windows, and like this one is almost the whole month of March, and the other one is a whole month from April to May. So are we really going to be testing during these entire windows, given the amount of devices that you've budgeted for?
Okay,
is
so
the schedule
right.
going to be on special testing
Right.
for this entire window, these
Right.
two windows?
Right. So first of all, a couple things with respect to the financial consideration slide.
Right.
I want you to realize that that's probably going to be over 3 budgets that those investments are being made. We're constantly upgrading what we do for what we do regardless of park, meaning our broadband, meaning the number of wireless access points, how many students can get on the internet at a given time. We're always trying to keep up with that and make it stronger. Park, unfortunately, is just driving that issue a little faster and a little harder. So we're looking to do as much as we can from this year's budget, as well as next year's budget, and that will probably involve a 2-year lease purchase, because money is almost free right now to borrow in order to get the purchasing done. So you're looking at paying for devices probably over 2 years. Unfortunately, Mr. McLaughlin couldn't be with us tonight, but we've been working on that issue together. As far as what you asked about, what's it going to look like? Again, I go back to what I was describing before. We're not really sure yet, but the basic idea is you've got to have let's just take 1 week at a time, okay? You have 2 weeks, essentially. When I say weeks, I mean a week that a given student is going to be testing, okay? You've got 75% of the way through the year and 90% of the way through the year. So a given student has, assuming that they're doing all of them, because there are little exceptions for algebra, geometry, and so on as to who has to take what when, but assuming you're doing all of it, you've got 5 days of testing, okay, that are roughly an hour, 60 to 80 minutes each per day at 75% through the year, and then another 4 days at 90% through the year. So you as a student are disrupted for those 9 days that you are doing the testing. Now, when it comes to the building, let's say Williametta Middle School's got to test 6th, 7th, and 8th graders, and each of these testing windows is 20 days. You got to test all the kids in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade in 20 days. How could you do that? Well, basically there's 2 strategies we're looking at. One, you try to have enough devices just at Williametta that you can test all the students in the building for 5 days straight and just be done in a week. Big challenge because now you've got all 1,600 devices working at Annan at the same time, accessing the internet, trying to get the testing done, okay? Plan B, you give Annan 1/3 of the number of devices I just described, and you leave those devices there for the whole 20-day window, okay? So now you're looking at testing the 6th grade for a week. Then the 7th graders use the same devices for a week. Then the 8th graders come and use the same devices for a week. So in 3 weeks, you've cycled through the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. The question there is, while the 6th grade is testing, how disruptive is it to the 7th and 8th grade? When the 7th grade starts testing, what are you doing with the 6th and the 8th? When the 8th grade's testing, what are you doing with the 6th and 7th? And can you run a bell schedule of regular classroom meetings while you're also testing a whole grade of students? And that's the challenge that the principals are up at night about right now, trying to figure out if there's a way to do that and still keep the instruction going for the students that are not actually taking the test. And we're looking at both ways. Obviously, if you're testing all the kids at once in a given building, that means you've got to get enough machines into that building to make that work, which means moving machines all over the district, which, as Matt, astutely put a little asterisk next to that, he recognizes that that issue in and of itself represents a whole other challenge, moving these devices around.
Right, plus the staff to do it.
Plus the staff to do it. Yeah, and the other thing is to keep in mind, as you're probably familiar, when the high school is doing the HSPA, I mean, everything else just shuts down for 2.5 hours in the morning. And many of the staff are involved in getting that testing accomplished. So if you bring everybody in, and some people are administering tests to the 11th graders, do you have enough staff to try to run regular classes with the 9th, the 10th, and the 12th graders? Because normally you need extra staff to get the test administered. So, there's no shortages of challenges. I mean, if you like a good challenge, you should come on over to my office because we're really challenged right now.
I'm done for now.
Okay.
I had a couple, I guess from the Finance Committee perspective, we've been talking about these Chromebooks, and I think our original thought was let's go as few as possible so that, because we have these tight budgets as usual, and I think our concern had been, let's not have a big expense here and try to, minimize that. But I think now listening to this, it seems like my thoughts really go the opposite way, because to the extent that we can minimize disruption of school and academic learning otherwise, it would be nice just to get the testing done if possible. So I think it'll be interesting to see what you present to us as far as, different options on what we can afford, and obviously it'll go with what we can afford. But I just see moving around devices. I just picture moving around a little laptop at my house and what can happen. I can only imagine if you've got, hundreds of these and what could go wrong. With respect to the Common Core assessments, the common assessments at the high school, will these be will students even know that these are these kind of tests, or will it just be a regular test and they won't necessarily know that that's a common assessment?
I'd be happy.
Anyone?
Yeah. I can't even hear me. You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I can't. This mic is. So I think Brian's point earlier about the middle school was, we are administering common
Right.
assessments at the middle school and students don't know. I think the goal is, this is something I don't know that we did a really good job with, was we kept saying that the quarterlies were regular tests, but we modified the schedule. We did ramp up the stress. So I think our goal would be twofold. One is to keep this idea of common assessment. Students may not necessarily know it's being administered, but also in doing so, you do ramp down the stress a little bit because
Right.
you aren't hyping them up. This is a 1-hour test, high stakes test, and yet you're still getting that quality benchmark data back on the common assessments.
But that was my concern, because if you can do that way, it seems like you're getting the benefit without the negative stress level for the students. And if that's the case, my one question I was going to ask before is, are we going to have all of them done at the same time, or are they going to be spread out throughout the year? For example, right now you have everything in 1 week. I assume that you would do it differently. You'd have English maybe 1 month and something else different?
Right, and that's kind of what we talked about, where the idea is that the supervisory staff would be working on that. So part of my goal as the director would be working with the supervisors to see how we spread them out equitably for each grade level, for each content area, so that it's not in this certain week there happens to be 3 common
Right.
assessments, which is a great focus. Now, as Mr. Syatt mentioned, if it's just another test and they're falling on the testing days at Ridge on the correct testing day, that should already help a lot.
Right.
With the idea being the goal of the common assessment is to help improve instruction. So all assessments, it's always good feedback for a student to know how they did, how they performed, but really the goal of a common assessment is so that as an instructor, I can look at how did my strategies work? When I went over that material, was it effective? Did they actually learn what I thought I was teaching them? And the fact that it's common lets us all speak that same language when we're in a meeting together and break down those problems. So that's kind of the point of it. So the fact that the students won't know it, we're hoping solve some of the stress issues, but still giving us the valuable information we want from them.
Yeah, that sounds like a real improvement. The one thing I am concerned about, though, with this, I guess I knew about Park, but I didn't realize how many hours it was going to be. For the elementary students, to me, it seems hard to understand how that will work, but that wasn't our choice. That's the state's. But at the high school, the idea